Good evening. We're going to still be working with King Saul of Israel, King David of Israel, King Solomon of Israel. And I hope you're trying to do what I'm trying to do, and that's learn what I can learn about me by observing what they have done and how it affected their lives. And with King Saul, we're getting close to the end of his time in the biblical account, and particularly the one in First Samuel. We're getting close to the end of that time, and he is not doing so well. Uh, Saul was one that was chosen by God to be the first king of Israel. He was indwelt by the Holy Spirit of God to guide, and direct, and as he endeavored to function as a king of Israel. But one of the things that he forgot to do was, even though he was the king, he forgot to give the reverence to God that he needed to give. And I think, sad to say, the vast majority of human beings do that. And I can't change anybody else, but I can change me. And you can't change anybody else, but you can change you. And we can have a commitment to God, to serve him, to please him, which means that we're going to be obeying what he's told us to do. Now, and if you were living in the time prior to the flood, God seemed to be speaking pretty directly to certain people, and wasn't much more successful than he is when he spoke later on through other people like Abraham and Moses and other individuals that God used, prophets and judges, other men that he used to lead and guide in the nation Israel. And today, when those who accept Jesus Christ as their Savior, they actually have the Spirit of God living in them. And he's with us to guide us and direct us in all truth. And he inspired spiritual men of God to write the Word of God, the Bible, for our learning and our ability to know what pleases God so that we'll do what is honoring to God and obedient to God and is in our best interest. And what Satan has always done, and he's doing it today, just as surely as he did in the Garden of Eden, that's come along and whisper in our ear or scream in our ear, or however he gets our attention, and try to convince us that it'd be more fun, more fulfilling. Somehow we're being deprived if we're submitting our will to God's will and obeying God in our life. And I'm talking about all of the areas of our life that God speaks to in the Bible. And that covers a lot of area. But in working with Saul, Saul, of course, disobeyed God, and he didn't destroy the Amalekites as he was told to, and he saved Agag alive, and he allowed the people that he said they wanted to do it. They actually says that they talked him into it, saving the best of the animals for sacrifice to God. And I commented Sunday that Saul seems to ask Samuel for forgiveness of his sins, and he seems to refer to God as Samuel's God, and doesn't, in the text at least, refer to him as his God. And I think that may have been the problem. But the fact of the matter is, however, what his personal relationship with God was as to his salvation, God knows, and I don't. So that's where we are. But at the point where we are in the story, David has been a man that has been able to be of help to Saul, because Saul found that he was having an evil spirit or a bad spirit from God that came upon him after the Spirit of God left him. And his people suggested that he uh, find somebody that can play the harp. And if you thought it was all just going along on the basis of a big accident, why you might say, as fate would have it, there happened to be a man that could play the harp very well and was a fine, upstanding person. And he just happened to be the person that God had anointed to be king after he said he was through with Saul. But it wasn't, I'm sure, just as things would happen, but it put Saul in a position where he actually was haunted. I would say virtually haunted by the relationship he had with David, excuse me. And the more Saul saw of David, the more impressed he was with David, and the more afraid he was of David. And the route that he chose to take was to try to kill David. And yet David was in his house. David was his armor bearer for a period of time. David was the one that came and played the harp when he was in a bad humor. And it worked for him. It brought him relief. But then it wasn't time for David to become king. And where we are with David, we kind of mesh the two. We're moving into David as we move out, you might say, of the story relevant to Saul. But David is herding sheep for his father in between times that he's working with King Saul. And he goes out to where the Philistines are battling the children of Israel, and Goliath is a giant who's coming out and challenging Israel. And this is where we left him Sunday. Challenging Israel and saying, send us a man and we'll fight. And if you beat us, if you can beat me, then we will serve you. The Philistines will serve you. If I beat you, your man that comes to represent you, then you'll serve the Philistines. And of course, being significantly larger in size and stature of anybody else, even larger than Saul, who was head and shoulders taller than the average Israeli warriors, and everybody was afraid of him. And so David goes out and recognizes him for what he was. He was an uncircumcised Philistine. He didn't believe in God. He worshiped pagan gods, false gods. And yeah, he was big and he was powerful and he was scary looking, and I'm sure had a gruff voice to go with his scary looks. And yet he was an uncircumcised Philistine who was challenging the army of the living God, the creator of heaven and earth. So David says, well, the Lord's been with me when I was confronted by a bear and a lion, and I didn't have any big problem with it, and they're scarier than this guy is. And if the Lord's with me, why, we can take him out, or I can take him out. And so, of course, Saul is told that there's somebody that, and at this point, Saul doesn't seem to recognize David. It's a little different than you would think, or I would think anyway. But he doesn't seem to recognize who David is, because he asked one of his people, who is this man that's going to go fight Goliath? And so Saul gives David his armor and some weaponry and all that kind of stuff, a coat of mail and a bronze helmet on his head and Saul's armor, and says, well, you go and the Lord will be with you, and I'll stand here and pray for you, so to speak, and shaking my boots. But so David fastened all the gear that Saul gave him on. In 1 Samuel 17 we are, and verse 38 is where the text is that I'm thinking about. And then he tried to walk, and because he'd never tried to walk with all that gear on, and that gear, I'm sure if you added it all up and put it as you put it on, why it was significantly heavy gear. And after he tried to walk, David said to Saul, we're told that I can't walk with these, for I've not tested them. And so David took them off. And you could draw a lot of maybe analogies. A man of God is going to do what God's going to empower him to do, doesn't need help from a man like Saul, with the only weapons and armor that Saul had access to share with him, and the only confidence that Saul had, which wasn't any at that point, that he could defeat Goliath. David and Saul should have realized, he really doesn't need what I got, because he's depending on the army of the living God. He's as part of the army of the living God and representing the army of the living God. He's looking to God to guide and direct whatever he does and enable him to succeed in the venture. But David was willing to try, and he did try, but he couldn't do anything with that stuff. And when he get down to what David was used to, he was used to a bag that he put stones in, that he put into a sling that he slung with his hand, and then he was a good enough shot with it that he was able to take out an animal or a person, and it didn't have to be real close range. He could do it at some distance. So he takes off all of the armor and all of that other stuff that Saul had, and he took what he was familiar with, what he had proven in his lifetime that God could use to protect him in tough situations. We're told in verse 40 of 1 Samuel 17 that he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook. Why he chose 5 and not 6 or 2, or why he took more than one, I don't know. But anyway, he took 5 and put them in a shepherd's bag that he carried with him, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So he's got the clothes on his back, his sling and a pouch for the stones, and his sling and a pack to put the gear in, and he's walking toward the Philistine. And the Philistine come out, and as he got close to David, there was a man in front of the Philistine who bore the shield that went before him. So it's not only this man, but this guy in front of him that's supposed to block anything that would be fired shot from a bow, arrow, or sling, or anything of that nature is the idea. However, the gentleman with the shield had a problem figuring out where the stone was going to come from when it came out of a sling. But anyway, that was what he was supposed to do. And so when he gets close, the Philistine looks down and sees David, and he disdains him. In other words, he ridicules him. He belittles him. He talks down to him. He looks down at him, and literally he does, because he's taller than he is by considerable. And then he begins to chide him or to make fun of him. He looked at David, and David is accurately described as only a youth, ruddy and good looking. I know that when I was first introduced to this story, my picture of David was comparable to my picture of myself. I thought of him almost as a child. He wasn't a child. He was a man, but he was a young man. I understand the description of being a youth, ruddy and good looking. He probably didn't have a heavy beard, if he had a beard at all. His face was pretty smooth and tanned probably. And he was a handsome looking young man, but he was a young man. And sometimes I think, when I think about stories like this or situations involving young men, I think about the grandsons that I have here in Sacramento where we live. Okay, I would say they would fit that category. They're ruddy, they're good looking, they're youthful, and they are, rapid. One of them's in the university, and one of them's about to get out of high school and go into university, and so they're young men, and they're not children, but they're young men, and actually they probably are at the point where if they faced a lot of the challenges, say uh, like this, looking at the situation, they might realize, you know what, this guy Goliath he's, if it isn't for God, this guy is not going to leave much of me when he gets through. And I like to think when it came to, even when it was done, and I'll maybe mention this again, that David, as he walked over here after he hit the guy with the stone and taken him out, knocked him out, he didn't have a sword. The guy's laying face down on the ground, so he has to get a sword from the guy, Goliath, and then whacks his head off, and then picks it up and carries it off with him. Well, there's not very many young people, not very many old people probably, that would be comfortable doing that, picking up somebody's head and walking off with it. But that's what David's going to do. And so Goliath's making fun of him in verse 43, and he says, "Am I a dog that you come after me with a stick or with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. In other words, he called on the false gods that the Philistines worshipped to curse David, who was trusting in the living God that created the heavens and the earth and giants and everything else that's here that we enjoy and some things that we're afraid of. And so he's insulted, Goliath is, because David thinks he's going to beat him with sticks, and he curses him by the name of his gods. And he said to David, "Come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." And then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." So he didn't back off. He didn't cower. He didn't hesitate. He wasn't frightened. He just said it the way it is. "Yeah, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin," and they could have said a shield and a guy to carry your shield. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And I believe that there are a lot of situations that where we're faced or challenged by the world in which we live, Satan, who is the God of this world, people who serve Satan, who live in the same world that we live in, and oftentimes have convictions and goals and agendas that are far afield from what we as a Christian should have as to how we're going to live our life. And then sometimes we get intimidated. But I believe when we get intimidated because we forget whose we are. And we forget why we do what we do, because the God that created the heavens and the earth and we ourselves is the one that tells us what we should do. And we may be insulted, we may be laughed at, we may be ridiculed, we may not get jobs, we may not get promotions if we're at work someplace, we may actually lose a job because we are unwilling to stoop in maybe our standard of integrity to the level that some people are in a job similar to the one we have. We might actually lose it. I have known people were well up in corporate America that have lost jobs because they stood for the truth, and they wouldn't lie. They wouldn't distort the facts in order to make it, either to hide something that somebody did that they don't want to be held accountable for, or to maybe hide it for their own sake, their own hide. But they've lost. And I've known some of those people that have actually seen it to the other side and would say, no, in the long run, I won. It turned to my best interest. God is the one that helped me do what would enable me to achieve more than I would have been able to achieve if I had chosen to follow the world's way and fudge the truth. And that's where David is at this point in his life. He's nobody officially, nobody. He knows what God has said about him, and he knows the Spirit of God indwells him, and he knows what he understands is going to be his future, which it was as king in Israel. But how it's going to all work out, he really doesn't know, and he really doesn't. I guess that's one of the things that I'd like to try to emphasize this evening is that he really didn't know. If I get there, which I may not, I would like to read a psalm that David wrote during the time that he was running and hiding for his life from not Goliath, but from the king of Israel, Saul. And you know, we can read about it, and to me, it's what I am always encouraging others to do and try the best I can to do myself is put myself in their place, because they're just human beings. David, as a boy, had all of the enthusiasm and positive outlook and all that every young boy probably has, particularly if they have a reasonably balanced and stable home environment at all, which David did. And yet he found himself at the end of Saul's reign, where Saul had an insane and unsatisfiable desire to destroy him physically, literally. And he did all kinds of conniving and fooling around. He gave him a wife, hoping that the wife would be a snare to him. He intended to give one woman to him, and he didn't. And someone else who loved David, he did give to David, and she protected David. So again, if you take God out of the equation, you'd have a whole lot different story. But God's in the equation, and God's in all of the equations of our lives. And in one way or the other, he's in the equation of everybody's life on the face of the earth. So again, David at this point, he's very positive with what's going to happen with the Goliath. And so he says in chapter 17 and verse 46, the Lord will deliver me into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. This day I will give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know, that all the earth may know. This is the purpose of all of this. David is saying, and I believe the Spirit of God indwelling him is motivating him to say what he's saying. This day I'll give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. And that's what happened. That's exactly what happened. And And then he goes on to say, then all this assembly, the people fighting on both sides of that war, all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give it into our hands. And so when David gets through with making that presentation to Goliath, we read in the next thought is that the Philistines arose, the Philistine Goliath arose and came and drew near to meet David. And David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. Just one stone and a sling, and a man of faith, young man, and an inexperienced warrior as far as that goes, but a young man of faith doing what God told him and wanted him to do. And we read that David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, and he took the Philistine's sword, and drew it out of his sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. Okay, that's pretty graphic. And if you sit down and meditate on the graphics a little bit, it's a pretty gory scene. And it's a bloody scene. And David, as he's going back to his own people, carrying his bloody head, it's not very appetizing. But he did it not because he was a hardened, harsh, tough old man, but he was a youth that God was enabling to do some things that will cause you to lose your dinner if you stop and think about it too long. And so the Philistines, of course, they realized, wait a minute, we had a deal here. The deal was, if our man wins, they become our servants. If their man wins, we become the servants of the Jews, the Israelites. And so they start running. The Philistines saw that their champion was dead. They fled. And the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. Okay, when you picture as it was, we read more Sunday. I didn't want to back up that far, but I didn't want to back up at all. But that the Jews were scared. I mean, when Goliath would come out and roar and tell him what he was going to do and offer his proposition, and he'd been doing it for 40 days, every day. And not a man in the whole army of Israel, including the King Saul, had the courage, had the confidence in the Lord, had the love of God enough to motivate him to say, I'm not just going to stand by here and let this guy do this day after day after day for 40 days. But it was David that God used and empowered and enabled to get the job done. And it was a pretty gory job for a young man. But it would have been a gory job for anybody, but particularly for a young man. But look at the change. Once Goliath falls, once David takes his stand, and once the Philistines started running, all of the Israelites jumped on and went after him. Okay, where was all that courage before? They all were allegedly worshiping the same God, serving the same God, who would have saved any one of them, theoretically, if they'd have had the love, the faith, the motivation to take the risk, if you want to put it that way, to step out by faith and do something, not something that they figured out that they thought that they ought to do, but do something that God had told them to do. And as we go through life, the younger we come to the place that we realize those kinds of situations are going to be with us all of our life. And I have a commitment that whether it's a lion or a bear that's trying to steal one of my sheep, or whether it's a big giant that's trying to promote a proposition that he'd come out and fight any of us who are like grasshoppers in his eyes and like grasshoppers in our own eyes, that we're going to step out and we're going to fight, because we're going to do what the Lord tells us to do, because we love the Lord with all our heart. And it's not just talk. What he tells us in his word, he wants us to do. What he tells us in his word, he doesn't want us to do. That's what we want to do. There's a phrase in an old country western song, and it's funny how things stick in your mind, but I mean, it goes way back to when I was probably 16 or less. And the phrase in it is, the lyrics are primarily a wife speaking to her husband. And the lyric is, what pleases you pleases me. What pleases you pleases me. And I've thought about that many, many times in my life in this context of, as a Christian, serving the Lord. And I've thought about it also in the light of a marriage. If you're a wife or you're a husband, if you have a wife whose commitment is what pleases you pleases me, then things will probably go very well. If that's really the case, what pleases you? That's what Peter talks about in 1 Peter 3. A wife that comes to the place, even if she's got a husband that doesn't obey the word, what pleases him pleases her, because it pleases him. And that's where David was. What pleased God, and what Goliath was doing in belittling the God or defying the God of the nation Israel, David said, the slaying is just as effective as his staff, as Goliath's sword, as his spear, his big brawny hands. The Lord can take care of it. It's not a problem. And the account goes ahead in chapter 17, verse 53, that the children of Israel chased the Philistines and plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David going out, this is the point that's kind of interesting to me, because David had been interacting with Saul. Now that maybe as he was interacting with Saul, he came across younger. Excuse me. But as David was going out against the Philistine, Saul said to Abner, the commander of the army, whose son is this youth? Because he recognized this kid, he's got something I can use. He's got something I can use. And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I don't know. I don't have a clue in our language who he is. I don't know him. So Saul tells Abner, inquire whose son this young man is. And then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. So so David is still packing this ugly old giant head around with him. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" So David answered, "I'm the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." He wasn't a stranger really to Saul, but at this point, Saul doesn't apparently recognize who he is. And so from kind of that point on in Saul's life, David is a thorn. I mean, he's admired, he's respected, but he's not. He's the one that the Holy Spirit left Saul and went to David, and then a spirit of trouble and misery, and I would say the roughly equivalent of a guilty conscience, began to haunt Saul. And David is the one that's brought in to play the harp to appease his soul and his emotions and his heart when he's disturbed by the spirit of God, the evil spirit of God that came on him. And he behaves himself well. And then as they come back from slaughtering the Philistines, we read in chapter 18 that as they were returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, the women sang and danced and said, "Saul has slain his 1,000 and David his 10,000. Well, to me, Saul is pretty much concerned with Saul, and Saul is pretty much wanting what Saul wants and what Saul wants to do, and he is, and so he reacts at this provocation consistent with his nature, his personality. Saul was very angry. We read in verse 8 of chapter 18. And the saying displeased him. And he said, Saul said, "They've ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed only 1,000s. Now what more can they have but the kingdom?" Well, the fact of the matter is, Saul, that's what he's going to have, is the kingdom. But the next verse 9 says that Saul eyed David from that day forward. And then the next day, and it's interesting that the text says in verse 10, and it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came on Saul. And he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand as at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul cast that spear, for he said, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David escaped his presence twice. So he tried to stick him to the wall twice with his spear, and David was able to avoid it. So David played music with his hand as at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand as there hadn't been in other times. And so Saul decided he was going to try to kill him. And from that time on, Saul was of that bent. It was that intent. And then the verse 13 says that Saul was afraid, 12 says, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. And the next thought is, but had departed from Saul. And Saul wasn't going to be repentant. He wasn't going to accept the consequences graciously. He was going to be angry with certainly David, who was the one that was going to be the next king, and probably God also, if it was a point that was dealt with, but it wasn't. And so Saul removed him from his presence and made him a captain over thousands, and he went out and came in before the people. So Saul got rid of him in the household, put him in the military, and as you continue with the account, what Saul is hoping is that he'll get killed. David will be killed as they go back and forth between one war after the other. But the text again tells us David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. And then the next thought means that just upset Saul. Then Saul saw that he behaved wisely. He was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. And they saw him as he dealt with the situations. And then Saul said to David, "Here's my older daughter, Merab, and I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." And that sounds like a wonderful gesture that he would want David for a son-in-law. But the text tells us what was going on in Saul's heart. Saul thought, "Let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." In other words, he was a hypocrite. Saul was pretending to want to honor David, but he was really hoping that I don't know what kind of a person his daughter was, but I don't know whether he figured that girl will drive anybody mad or something. But as it turned out, she didn't wind up marrying David, but she was married off to somebody else, Adriel the Mehethalite. And David had another daughter. Her name was Michal. And Saul's daughter Michal loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him, Saul. So Saul said, "I'll give her to him, that she might be a snare to him." So again, he's going to try with another daughter to get him hooked up as a husband and wife so that his daughter could sabotage David. So they have two things going for him. I'll give her that she can be a snare to him, and the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So she got two negative. Saul has engineered two negative situations to go against David. Okay, whenever we are in a situation where we are pretending that we are something that we are not, or that we're pretending to favor somebody, honor somebody, bless somebody, support, help, enrich somebody, when really the object is to get them killed or in some other way out of the picture in your life, there's something wrong with us. I mean, really seriously wrong with us. And of course, in this case, we know what it is. Saul has disobeyed God repeatedly, and the Spirit of God has departed from Saul, and a troubling spirit from God has come upon Saul, and he knows he's going to lose the kingdom. It isn't going to be established as a perpetual kingdom. It was taken from him, and he's not repentant. He's in the mix. He's involved in all kinds of things going on in Israel at that time, and he's involved in David's life, and he's trying to get David killed. And as time goes on, he gets more and more involved in that, even to the point of taking 3,000 men on more than one occasion and go after David, literally, and to try to get David married to one of his daughters who would be a snare to David. And so, David don't seem real anxious to get married to one of his wives, but Saul gets his people because David is saying, I don't deserve to be a son-in-law of the king. There's something about that I'm nobody. And so Saul has his servants go communicate to David that the king delights in you, and all his servants love you, and now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants, at the instruction of Saul, spoke those words in the hearing of David. And David says, does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law? Seeing I am poor and lightly esteemed, I'm a poor and lightly esteemed man. And so the servants go back to Saul and they say, hey, this is what David said. He's not too excited about this deal. So again, Saul is struggling to try to do away with David because he disobeyed God. And he knows that David is obeying God and that David is going to be the next king if he can't get him to killed some way. And so in chapter 18 and verse 14, we read, David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel loved him. And yet he tries to get David tricked up some way or another in every way that he can. And so he encourages David to be valiant for him and fight the Lord's battles. And again, we're told what he's really thinking. For Saul thought, quote, let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. And then it turned out, as I said already, that Mira was given to somebody else, and Michal becomes Saul's daughter, and she loved David, and Saul was happy to let her go. Again, I will give her his thoughts, we're told. I will give her to him that she may be a snare to him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you should be my son-in-law today. So David comes back from chasing the Philistines in chapter 24. We're jumping through the time a little bit. And the Philistines told Saul, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. So the Philistines apparently are trying to double cross David or get him tripped up with Saul, and they're telling him where David is. And Saul takes 3,000 chosen men from Israel, and he goes looking for David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. So David and his men that were with him, they're hiding from Saul. And so Saul, with his 3,000 men, comes to a sheepfold by the road where there's a cave. Saul went in to attend to his needs. In other words, they didn't have any rest stops in the area. So a cave made a good place to take care of your needs. But he happened to pick a cave that David and his men were hiding in. So if you kind of picture this setting, Saul and goes into this cave for privacy to take care of his needs. And back in the cave, David and his men are hiding, and they don't know it. Saul doesn't know it. And they're in the recesses of the cave, it says, back further into the cave. And then the men of David say to David, this is the day which the Lord has said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you. In other words, you can take him out now, because this worked out just right for you. And the interesting thing about it is we're going to find a difference in the attitude of David and Saul. So we're actually working slowly into looking at the life of David, but David and Saul, they had a number of years of interaction with each other that was something less than pleasant, to say the least. And so David's in the cave, Saul is in the cave taking care of his physical needs. And we read that David rose and secretly cut off the corner of Saul's robe. In other words, he went to where either Saul had taken off his robe, or if he was squatted down or something, he cut the corner off of Saul's robe. And it happened afterward. Now think about this a minute. Saul's trying every way he can to ensnare and get David killed, and if need be, he's willing to do it himself. And David has a chance to take Saul out. But instead of taking Saul out, killing Saul, he cuts off the corner of his robe. And then in verse 5, we get some insight into David's thoughts. Now, it happened afterward, after he cut the corner off the robe, that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. And you might think, as a human being, as human beings often do, well, everybody think, well, that's crazy. He had a chance to kill him. Why did he kill him? Why just take the corner of his robe? He could have just as easily killed him, that's for sure. But then David had a concern for Saul, because Saul was still functioning as the king of Israel, placed there by God. And Saul, while he gave David every reason to want to take him out, David wasn't going to do it. He didn't even have a clear conscience because he cut off the corner of his robe, is the point. And so he says to his men, quote, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master." How come he's your master? He's trying to kill you, and you're going to have his job. Yeah, but he's still the Lord's master. The Lord still has him as the king. And so again, he's telling his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do anything to my master, the Lord's anointed." Saul, in King David to be's eyes, was still the Lord's anointed. In other words, as far as David was concerned, the Lord put Saul there, and the Lord can take Saul out, and I'll do my best to stay alive, but I'm not going to take him out when I get a chance. And so, again, his statement, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." So David restrained his servants, because I'm quite sure that some of David's servants didn't share his conscience. But David restrained his servants with these words and did not allow them to rise against Saul. Now then, if we put Saul in David's place and David in Saul's place, and if it was true that the people talked Saul into saving the best of the animal sacrifices, then the people would have been able to talk David into taking out Saul. But David's not going. And he's not going to allow them to do it either if he can stop it. So David restrained his servants from these words and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went away, not even realizing how close he'd come to death. And David rose afterward and went out of the cave and called out to Saul, saying, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. So David bows down to Saul. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, quote, indeed, David seeks your harm, unquote. He says, look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave, and someone urged me to kill you, but my eye spared you, and I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he's the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand, for in that I cut off the corner of your robe and didn't kill you, you know I see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you. And yet you hunt my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me. Let the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the prophet of the ancient says, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. So David is true to his conscience, to the anointing of God on a man by the name of Saul, who he had taken his spirit from because he wasn't functioning the way he should have been. But David's not going to take it into his hand to kill this man, the king, Saul, even though the man's trying to kill him. And he's literally running for his own hide. I got just a few minutes. I'm going to look at Psalms 142, and it's titled, A Contemplation of David, a prayer when he was in the cave. And I think it gives us some insight as to how David was hurting by all that was going on over the years that this carried on. And David says, I cry out to the Lord with my voice. With my voice to the Lord, I make supplication. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare before him my trouble. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then you knew my path in the way in which I walked. They have secretly set a snare for me. Look on my right hand and see, for there is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul. I cried out to you, O Lord, and I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from the persecutors, for they are stronger than I. I bring my soul out of prison that I may praise your name. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully with me. That's a prayer of David in anguish as he's running for his life due to no fault of his own. Now, later on in David's own life, there's a time when David suffers because of his own sins. But I believe that it's critical that we realize if we're going to serve the Lord, it needs to be a commitment of our heart to obey what God tells us to do in his word, the Bible, the portion that's applicable to us, with the best of our ability, regardless of whether it's painful or pleasant. And there will be both painful and pleasant times as we go through life. And next Sunday, we'll modulate into David's life more surely. But think about Saul, a man after God's own heart. He was not. But a man who was the Lord's anointed, he was. And David wasn't going to take it in his hand to kill the Lord's anointed, even if it would be the natural thing for a human being to want to do. Christians are committed to do the right thing, even if it's not fun. And actually, that's where the joy of the Lord becomes our strength. I'll stop there. We look forward to being together this coming Sunday. Hit the like button, if you will, and invite others to join with us. May the Lord bless you. Goodbye.